At least since Diderot, the main tradition of criticism in all the arts, appealing to such apparently dissimilar criteria as verisimilitude and moral correctness, in effect treats the work of art as a statement being made in the form of a work of art. Such a treatment has little to do with what actually happens when a person possessing some training and aesthetic sensibility looks at a work of art appropriately. A work of art encountered as a work of art is an experience, not a statement or an answer to a question. Art is not only about something, it is something. A work of art is a thing in the world, not just a text or commentary on the world.
Often leave films with more answers than questions. What I mean by that is, sure, I have questions about how certain projects get funded, how certain decisions get approved, and why audiences react to certain things the way they do. Yes, there are questions, but not any questions whose answers or lack of answers feel fulfilling, satisfying, or engaging. It's hard to watch so many movies that have their actors quite literally summarize to me the filmmaker's opinions. It feels like it's a way for them to signal to us that they themselves are woke and good. Which, why would I watch your movie to find those things out about you when I can just go on your Twitter? You don't look at a painting to learn that capitalism is bad. If you want to understand the whys and hows of the various systems that oppress us, you read theory. And good art can and maybe should spark that curiosity. Roger Ebert famously says,
"And for me, the movies are like a machine that generates empathy. It helps us to identify with the people who are sharing this journey with us. And that, to me, is the most noble thing that good movies can do, and it's a reason to encourage them and to support them and to go to them."
I think this can be said about all art forms. Most people who know me personally know that I mostly read political theory, history, and analysis. With that, multiple people recommended Don't Look Up to Me or were curious about my opinions on it because they thought that I would agree with the subject matter and would therefore like the movie. I can see why people think I'll enjoy movies that are overtly or metaphorically critical of capitalism. I understand it, but it's still frustrating because I genuinely do not enjoy a lot of these movies. With this video, I'm interested in speaking directly to well-intentioned progressive people who are coming to films for what they have to say. It's disheartening to see people look for confirmation of their ideals in plot and dialogue. I think we can engage with art and ideas that don't necessarily come from people who hold similar beliefs to our own. As someone who considers liberalism to be a conservative ideology, 90% of the time I'm not watching movies by people who share my worldview. I could very easily be someone who only watches communist propaganda films, but I have no interest in doing that. Not that they can't be great. And quite frankly, I'm not arrogant enough to believe that thinking exactly like me is what makes someone a good filmmaker. One of my most strongly held beliefs about film is that it's not a replacement for history books and literature. Like I've said before, it was around this time that I started to realize that movies could be something other than entertainment or an inadequate replacement for history books and literature. And so I started to think of art as another language with which not only to read social reality, but also as a means to present an alternative. For now, my point is that film is not a delivery medium for information. It's a complex and layered sensory experience. I think I have a fairly unique perspective from which to talk about this as someone who's primarily a photographer. Without photography, we wouldn't have cinema. At their core, movies are a series of photographs that create an illusion. Our minds make the leap from stillness to motion, and it's that suspension of disbelief that allows this medium to come to life. When we limit this to self-important dialogue that was written to be screenshotted for social media, we rob ourselves of this magic. Greta Gerwig's Barbie is one of many films that I'd originally planned on avoiding. After finally watching it for this video, unsurprisingly, it's emblematic of this disconnect. This movie's been described as a sort of reverse Wizard of Oz, where the end of the pink brick road is California. Where this movie really shines is off the page and in Katie Spencer and Sarah Greenwood's Hollywood Golden Age-inspired practical effects and sets. According to an interview with Architectural Digest, they were so committed to the actualization of Barbie Land that it literally exacerbated a worldwide shortage of Roscoe brand fluorescent pink. The painted skies and cityscapes on the soundstages reminiscent of the Emerald City, Ruth Handler's kitchen being inspired by the kitchen in Singing in the Rain, and the offices that recall Jacques Tati's Tativille are among the 29 filmic references Gerwig pulled from for Barbie. All of this effort makes it even more confusing when the script drags us into its lifeless, sermonizing monologues.
You've been making women feel bad about themselves since you were invented. You represent everything wrong with our culture: sexualized capitalism, unrealistic physical ideals. Look at yourself. You set the feminist movement back 50 years, you destroy girls' innate sense of worth, and you're killing the planet with your glorification of rampant consumerism. I am powerful, and until you showed up here and declared yourself Barbie, I hadn't thought about you in years, you fascist.
I think it's funny that Gerwig literally writes in the script that Sasha, the teenage daughter to America Ferrera's Gloria, is clearly so smart and so articulate that you can't help but admire her. Greta, you wrote her. Also, this attack on Barbie doesn't even feel like it's coming from Sasha, a character in this story, nor does it feel like Sasha fully understands what she's talking about.
Sexualized capitalism?
It's all sort of intentionally vague and muddled together. Like, teenage angst alone doesn't explain a proper understanding of sexualized capitalism, whatever she means by that. The movie's obviously not interested in her interiority, which, fine, she's your supporting character's supporting character. But then it's gonna feel cheap when our introduction to her, a teenage girl on the brink of womanhood, much like Barbie, is basically reduced to being a vehicle for the writers to preempt valid criticism of the Barbie brand and let us know that they're in on it. Margot Robbie addresses this in an interview with Time, saying, "In that very first meeting, we impressed upon Inan, we are going to honor the legacy of your brand. But if we don't acknowledge certain things, if we don't say it, someone else is gonna say it. So you might as well be a part of that conversation." Why are you using your movie to address controversy in order to justify its own existence instead of just making a movie whose existence is justified? Having Sasha call Barbie a fascist in the middle of what's effectively a Hydro Flask ad doesn't absolve Barbie of its legacy, and the film doesn't do much to that effect either. I mean, it can't, for many reasons. Among them, the fact that Mattel CEO is a hardline supporter of the state of Israel. And I mean, who's gonna tell him that ethno-states and ethno-nationalism are... Also, and maybe more pertinently, movies aren't effective methods for resolving complex socio-political problems. I'm not suggesting that Gerwig thinks her movies solve patriarchy, but genuinely, what do they help? I touched on this a little bit in my essay about Palestinian director Elia Sleiman, linked below. But Sleiman actively gives his people, his literal neighbors, agency over their own stories when he builds his films both with them and around them. He's giving voices to people who've been reduced to living in a ghetto that coincidentally happens to be Jesus's hometown. At no point do his films explicitly argue for Palestinian liberation, but instead they embody a liberatory resistance to occupation. And they're playful. In that essay, I compared The Time That Remains to The 400 Blows, which I believe to be, although not on the surface, a highly political film that, among many things, similarly deals with themes of authoritarianism and one's agency. I mean, I'd probably argue that both of those films, in all their compassion, are far more successful feminist works than Barbie. think one of the best and most well-known examples of a film that's full of political implications is Paul Thomas Anderson's 2007 film There Will Be Blood, starring Daniel Day-Lewis as a silver prospector turned oil man. Famously based on Upton Sinclair's novel Oil, it's one of my favorite films, and film bro connotations aside, I'm absolutely in the camp of people who believe this to be one of the best, if not the best film of the 21st century. I just watched it for the third time, the second time being in 2018 with a live performance of the score by the New York Philharmonic. To date, that's been one of the most impactful filmic experiences I've ever had. Despite all of its dark humor, it's a film that makes me profoundly uncomfortable, maybe more than any horror movie I've ever seen. The scene where the oil gushes out of the derrick and bursts into flames is such a hellish image, and yet it's shot so beautifully. In that moment that is so visceral, I find myself as entranced by this sticky, bloody substance as Daniel is, and I'm repulsed. A repulsion that creeps up repeatedly for me throughout the entire film as I'm pulled from moments of aspiration into darkness. In this scene, we move from day to evening to dusk to night, and then into a new morning, marking the end of a time that we can't go back to. In the night, the oil soaks Daniel, and suddenly he's engulfed by the darkness that surrounds him. This shot is singularly stunning, and somehow this film carries so many others that strike you just as forcefully. Anderson has us watch Plainview practically rip open the earth in pursuit of something beyond oil, beyond wealth.
The false promise of the horizon, yeah.
False promise.
Well, yes, because you arrived there, and of course the world is round.
Yeah, exactly. and all the joy or whatever. Do you think people like that think it's going to be joyful at the end, that somehow they're going to arrive and it's going to be a Garden of Eden and everything they thought is going to be that way? Or that somehow you're corrupted by the process, so when you get there, you instantly know there is no Garden of Eden. It simply served a purpose for me to keep charging.
The work becomes an end in itself. You know, if you compare that fever to the fever of prospecting, that those guys that thought they knew what they were after, which is the vast mansion on the Pacific coast, by the time they had accumulated enough wealth to build that pyramid for themselves, the work was actually an end in itself. The fever was the thing that they lived for.
That fever is the essence of capitalism, an insatiable Ouroboros that feeds on itself. The end of the film leaves Daniel Plainview in 1927 during the second or third recession of that decade, only 2 years away from the Great Depression, and it's honestly disquieting to consider that this movie was released the same month that we entered 2008's Great Recession. As I write this in 2025, oil is unfortunately still oil. But oil is also lithium. Oil is our attention. Oil is convenience. Oil is Mars and the stars and our entire galaxy. Or in the case of Adam McKay's 2021 film Don't Look Up, it's a comet hurtling towards Earth. In this film, two astronomers played by Leonardo DiCaprio and Jennifer Lawrence, I keep wanting to call her Katniss Everdeen. I've never even seen that movie. Okay. Discover that a comet is 6 months away from being the catalyst for the mass extinction event of the last 65 million years. They immediately take this to MAGA-coded President Orlean, who, after repeatedly dismissing them, reluctantly agrees to nuke the comet away from Earth as a way to further her political image. No sooner had she capitulated than Peter Isherwell, our Musk-Zuck-Bezos Frankenchild, redirected efforts into a plan for his company Bash to mine the comet for $140 trillion worth of rare materials. Predictably, tech hubris and cost-cutting measures aren't enough to save the planet. In the final months leading up to impact, Leo's increasingly direct pleas to just look up are met with a reactionary, conspiratorial, Don't Look Up campaign.
Don't look up! Don't look up!
The divisive counter-campaign is, as one would expect, propped up by the false promise of the conversion of the comet's raw materials into jobs and capital that will trickle down.
No politics. None.
What are you talking about? Your dad and I are for the jobs the comet will provide.
This ping-pong between the two camps inevitably leads to confusion among the public, as reflected in the scene between Bree and Jack, played by Cate Blanchett and Tyler Perry respectively, who are hosting Dr. Mindy on their talk show.
We're hearing that there is no comet, or that there is a comet,
Right.
that it's a good thing, or maybe it's a bad thing. We are so confused. So could you please help us out here, a wise scientist?
Later in this scene, Jack admits that he's bought shares of Bash because their stock prices are going gangbusters, and Bree responds to this by jokingly calling him a shameless capitalist. I get that this is their way of making it clear that these characters are indeed shameless capitalists, but this was made clear from the first time we met them. Like, why is this movie so patronizing? Why does it over-explain itself? Ask Katniss.
Well, maybe the destruction of the entire planet isn't supposed to be fun. Maybe it's supposed to be terrifying. When we're all 100% for sure gonna fucking die!
This monologue, to me, feels similar to Sasha's from Barbie in that it's preemptively trying to justify its own condescension. Yes, they are yelling at Bree and Jack, but they're also yelling at us. Also, I kind of resent how much backstory I've had to give you here before being able to even explain my criticisms, but McKay's approach to satire is so much about what happens. He doesn't really leave me a lot of room here for feeling or interpretation. Despite this, McKay wants to establish Don't Look Up as something more than a popcorn movie.
I think we're all tired of the politics.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's why we made Total Devastation. It's for everyone, it's a popcorn movie.
Total Devastation and things like the MCU seem like the antithesis to what he thinks of his work. Their known military propaganda, lack vision, our commercial slop, etc., etc.
This was a coordinated terrorist attack, sir.
I was a wartime general. Now I'm a wartime president.
Though he apparently helped co-write the Ant-Man movie. He's being self-aggrandizing, but I do think McKay genuinely believes his films to be educational tools.
We made a choice early on with the movie that we weren't going to back away from the actual information. When I was reading the book, I thought, well, wait a minute, you can do this, you just have to have a little bit of a conversation with the audience. What would happen if that pop culture gave us actual information?
People have commented on how the film's use of a comet might not be the best metaphor for a self-perpetuating system that's leading us to the brink of extinction in just a couple centuries. I personally take greater issue with the film's nihilistic depiction of the global south, which we really only get to see through cliched montages. I fucking hate these. I fucking hate these. The film presents the world as entirely the US's property to protect or destroy, and I find it hard to reconcile with the fact that the fate of the planet rests solely in the hands of Leo and Katniss. Like, I'm really meant to believe that the most concerned person on the planet keeps up with her roots for 6 months during the apocalypse? I don't believe that there wouldn't be political dissent and popular uprisings across the entire fucking planet. It's condescending, and it ultimately feels like it hates humanity, not just the elites that it aims to critique. Now, I'm not suggesting that Adam McKay himself hates humanity. This is just a chronic fault of so many movies that attempt to satirize capitalism's failings and our collective reaction to our circumstances. We'll come back to this. I mean, we just witnessed children and young adults being brutalized on Columbia's campus last year, fighting for the same cause as my own people in some of the most rural parts of Columbia. That cause being an unfaltering respect for life. It's wrong to suggest that basically everyone is complacent and that the majority of people can't be effectively organized, especially in the most dire of circumstances. Maybe I'm naive, but I fundamentally disagree with this helpless and disempowered position. Ultimately, the film feels like less of a warning of what could happen and feels more like a mirror that shows us what it thinks of us. It thinks so poorly of us and yet supposes to trust us with its message. Similarly, we've seen plenty of criticism of Don't Look Up for being too on the nose. Now, to be clear, I'm not against directness, and I'm not arguing for subtlety. There Will Be Blood is not a subtle movie. Agnès Varda is not a subtle filmmaker. Dziga Vertov is not a subtle filmmaker. Directness is not my problem. My issue with McKay is that his lack of subtlety has nothing to do with creating an affecting experience. I mean, he gives you an experience, don't get me wrong. Part of why I'm choosing to dissect his work is because, for better or worse, he employs so many cinematic techniques, especially in The Big Short and Vice. Among many, he uses multimedia, frenetic editing, nonlinear storytelling, stock footage, fourth wall breaks, animation, narration, direct address, and he even quotes himself. I can't even really think of another contemporary director who's reckoned with the power of the still photograph as much as McKay has. Rarely do we see a filmmaker who throws so much at the screen. And honestly, I do appreciate him doing the work. I don't know, it's hard to explain, but for some reason, it just doesn't work for me. There's a tension between his desire to be experimental in his filmmaking and his need to tell us everything. The problem is that narrative film can't tell you everything. I don't believe that they're the most effective vessel for delivering information comprehensively. There's a sense of urgency in all of McKay's recent work, and trust me, I get it. But I think there's a certain alchemy, for lack of a better word, that's getting lost in this tension. The purpose of satire isn't to make fun of someone for the sake of comedy, or at least this isn't the purpose of any satire that I'd personally categorize as witty or worthwhile. Satire, in all of its absurdity, might not even necessarily need to be funny. Because so often satire exists in conjunction with political criticism, is concerned with questions of morality, and carries an implication of intellectual value, in my opinion, the satirist has a moral obligation to punch up. Even 300 years ago, Jonathan Swift saw the utility in these satirical techniques. So I decided to take my research all the way back to a work that many consider to be a foundational piece in modern satire. His 1729 essay, A Modest Proposal. His proposal being that Irish Catholic tenants simply sell their babies to their Protestant English landlords as food. A win-win. As an aside, I think it's really funny that he claims he got this idea from the Americans, who were known for being good businessmen at the time. Despite being Irish, Swift speaks to the British as the British. He uses their own language and talking points to describe the Irish in a way that is dehumanizing, and seems to alternate between likening them to commodities and animals. Swift feigns appealing to their logic of market economics to question their soul. He asks us to take these prejudices to their next logical conclusion, and in doing so, he highlights the absurdity of the British worldview and points out their hypocrisy as Christians. Even though the text describes the Irish in the most vulgar of ways, I don't think it ever actually judges them. Swift makes several points around Irish people having large families and issues of overpopulation, which feel especially relevant today, as this is a fascist dog whistle brought up against poor and working people across the globe. Meanwhile, so many of our contemporary cinematic satires fail by degrading and talking down to the people whom they're addressing. They also often seem more concerned with trying to be funny, superior, and nonpartisan than with actually saying anything. Mike Judge's Idiocracy is one of the most glaring examples of this. Idiocracy basically argues for eugenics and is the epitome of scratch a liberal and a fascist bleeds. It's an overtly political movie that's dangerously misguided at best and explicitly fascist at worst. Honestly, the very thought of this movie being released to audiences across the political spectrum in 2007 is pretty horrifying. At the time of its release, we were about a year out from a global recession. We were collectively responsible for the deaths of millions of innocent people in the Middle East, and we were coming to terms as a nation with the fact that we'd elected an incompetent Nepo baby who lied on the world stage about WMDs.
I call upon all nations to do everything they can to stop these terrorist killers. Thank you. Now watch this drive.
Needless to say, it wasn't a great time for Americans, or for capitalism, really. It was a moment ripe for criticism. I hadn't seen Idiocracy in over a decade, but the internet tends to revisit this specific movie during Trump presidencies. I think this movie encapsulates the inclination to reduce the root of all problems to stupidity, which is perhaps not the most astute way to go about things. This lack of insight is evident outside of the dialogue as well. The image of trash and pollution that spans as far as the eye can see would be fair commentary if the West's overconsumption and military pollution hadn't already made that a present reality in multiple countries in the global South. The architecture in this movie is very Soviet brutalist inspired, which would be a staple in my utopia, but unsurprisingly, we're meant to gather that we're in a dystopia once we see even the hint of a brutalist building. I think one of the film's most glaring signals of its own racism, sexism, and classism is neatly packaged in how it subscribes to this weird language prescriptivism.
But the English language had deteriorated into a hybrid of hillbilly, valley girl, inner city slang, and various grunts.
So much of our contemporary conception of Southern culture is tinged by regressive views of their intellectual or radical capacities. Arlie Russell Hochschild's Strangers in Their Own Land, which many educated liberals picked up to crack the cultural pathology of Donald Trump's 2016 win, argues that poor white workers in Louisiana reject environmental protectionism not because heavily polluting chemical companies are essentially the only employers in various regions of the state, a claim many of the book's interviewees continually insist is actually the reason they do not support environmentalism, but because of an irrational aversion to the cultural politics associated with environmentalism. Faced with the complexity of Southern political attitudes, observers retreat to cultural explanations. When we reduce this complexity to intellectual inferiority, we impair our ability for collective action. It also doesn't take much research to learn about hillbilly culture's long subversive history. For what it's worth, I think that a lot of Appalachian English is really pretty. Also, it's funny that we're just about 2 decades into the future, and I don't even think the Valley Girl dialect, as we understood it, even still really exists anymore.
Like tubular. Well, it's like a totally great day. It's like totally awesome. Gag me with a spoon. It's grody to the max. That means it's disgusting. It's totally grody.
Idiocracy views society as completely
incapable of solving even its most basic problems.
And in doing so, sets up its story to be inherently condescending to its viewers. One of the wildest things to me about Idiocracy is how, even during the Bush administration, it quite boldly asks us to put our full faith in Joe as the leader of the free world. Kinda how we got here in the first place, but okay.
I think we should just trust our president in every decision that he makes, and we should just support that, you know?
And make no mistake, the movie doesn't think you're the smartest man in the world. It thinks we're destined to become the babbling masses. In my opinion, Don't Look Up falls into the same trap. McKay wrote himself into a corner when he created a crisis that affected the entire world and then proceeded to leave everyone out of it. In placing the fight for salvation in the hands of 2 smart white people who ultimately fail, he takes agency away from the people and leans into the idea that stupidity is our foremost issue. This premise has no space for and can't handle the possibility of popular uprising, and the movie is ultimately pessimistic in a way that I don't think he intended it to be. In the end, it's more of a disaster movie, a popcorn movie, if you will, than it is a good satire. While watching Idiocracy, my wife and I joked about how it's proof that any random-ass movie from the 2000s has better lighting and filmmaking craft than most contemporary movies today. For me, the crafting of this world was honestly entertaining, and I think it confronts capitalism, or at the very least does a better job of satirizing it than the actual writing. The hospital's diagnostic machine was inspired by a car wash, which is suggestive of the impersonal experience of visiting a doctor under an increasingly for-profit healthcare system. Even though it's 2007, the visual language still has a little bit of that Y2K retro future thing happening, which I love. Most of the clothing in this movie is like that shiny, athletic-y, plasticky Under Armour kind of polyester tech material, and it's covered in advertising. This is a great touch when we're talking about a world that makes it increasingly difficult to escape ads. The graphic design is punchy and humorous, and it fits into this world perfectly. According to an interview with Trivia Happy, Ellen Lampel, the film's graphic designer, found the project to be a release and said this about designing the logos. Sometimes in comedy, graphics are the straight man, but in Idiocracy, we let it be absurd as part of the experience. We realized that life in its present state already had tendencies towards the ridiculous. Branding seeps in everywhere, so we let it be over the top. The barcode tattoos definitely speak to the idea of a surveillance state that was especially relevant after the Patriot Act and is more and more relevant today. You all probably already knew this, but it's news to me that the USA Patriot Act is an acronym for Uniting and Strengthening America by providing appropriate tools required to intercept and obstruct terrorism. I'm sorry, but that's such a ridiculous and funny title. Now, I'm not saying the tattoos weren't heavy-handed, but a lot of these details make sense in the context of a heavily stylized satire. If you want a deeper analysis of the movie, its plot, and its politics, then I highly recommend watching Sarah Zed's essay, No, Idiocracy is Not a Documentary. I think perhaps the worst thing about Idiocracy, well, after the eugenics, is that WALL-E reminds me of it. WALL-E, that had the potential to be one of the greatest films in its own right, chose to defer to this fat-phobic, cynical, belittling treatment of humanity. How is it that a movie that has us watch these two robots dancing and playing among the stars can also arrive at these same miserable conclusions? The whole WALL-E tragedy is especially heartbreaking because for me, confronting outer space should reframe our understanding of both our home and our species. The view of the Earth from the moon fascinated me. A small disk 240,000 miles away. Raging nationalistic interests, famines, wars, pestilence don't show from that distance. When we're able to envision ourselves on a little blue marble together, it feels impossible that everything else wouldn't become absolutely inconsequential. From the view of the moon, we are what Archibald MacLeish describes as riders on the earth together, brothers in that bright loveliness in the eternal cold. After all, seeing Earth from the moon brought Alan Shepard to tears. It's scary to think about, but if we allow for nothing to ever be enough, then maybe our little blue marble won't be enough either. This is why I argue in this essay and in everything that I do for the importance of being in touch with our sensibilities. Swift's essay works in part because he writes from the righteousness of Christianity. Obviously, this specific framework isn't necessary for a satire, but the fact that he shares this belief system with those who were subjugating his people is incorporated into his technique for revealing their contradictions. The reality is that a lot of these examples that I've talked about, and many more, lack any real moral conviction, and therefore aren't in a position to effectively expose anything worthwhile. Another satire rooted in this contemporary tradition of blaming everything on brainlessness is Barbie. In Barbie land, oppression exists because the oppressed and their oppressors are too naive to notice. When we first meet the Kens, they're dopey and clueless to their own subjugation. Meanwhile, the Barbies are dumb blondes who simultaneously hold all the power, and everyone is blissfully ignorant. Not only is this reductionist, but it's wholly inaccurate to suggest that based on their gender alone, the Barbies, aka women, are incapable of violent exploitation. Systemic exploitation and governance is inherently violent and is not mutually exclusive from womanhood.
Yeah, I mean, it was out of the box because it was a female president. God knows if that'll ever happen.
In Barbie Land, being President Barbie is somehow magically divorced from brutality. Like, the Kens maybe live under an apartheid system, and we don't even get to see where they sleep. When Ken returns from the real world, bringing patriarchy along with him, we're simply shown a reversal of this dynamic. The Barbies tacitly accept this newfound patriarchy until they're able to be re-educated and made smart again. According to Gerwig, this just means remembering your girl boss capabilities and acknowledging the contradictions of womanhood for the first time, which somehow allows them to decide not to be oppressed.
By giving voice to the cognitive dissonance required to be a woman under the patriarchy, you robbed it of its power. Whoa, I just said all of that.
Gerwig's version of modern patriarchy is not only infantilizing and oversimplified, but it suggests that because patriarchy is senseless, that it is also baseless and removes its historical roots within capitalism and colonialism. By doing this, she can't make an effective critique about these structures, nor is she able to educate her audience about anything real. She removes any accountability from all parties involved in order to... I don't even know what. I can't even tell you what she's trying to accomplish outside of selling you Barbies.
The toy industry is a growth industry, and what is unique about the form factor is that it's tactile. Kids touch toys, hug toys, go to bed with toys. There's an emotional relationship between our product and our fans. And the opportunity is not just within the toy category, but as the owner of the underlying rights, we can develop our business outside of the toy aisle.
I'm not sure how more people didn't walk away from this movie feeling like their childhoods were being exploited, or at the very least, like it was an artistic farce. We're all familiar with the sort of statement that acquiesces to the bare minimum of radicality. I live in X conservative place, and so I'm happy that Barbie says anything at all about feminism in order to teach people things. The issue with this is that there's nothing to be learned from being vague and not challenging the status quo. And this lack of friction is by design. I mean, how else are you gonna make over $1 billion at the box office? Not only did Tag Heuer, Smeg, Birkenstock, Chanel, Chevy, and more have to agree to this messaging, but so did all the other brands that Mattel licensed out the Barbie name to. If a CEO approves of your over $300 million criticism, how subversive can it be? Unless you genuinely believe that you can be educated by a commercial, I don't understand what there is to learn from this movie. A commercial will only ever show you what's already accepted in the dominant culture. In trying to be broad enough in its appeal, it becomes pointless because it can't actually take a stance. Feminism can't be propped up on moral indeterminacy.
It's feminist in a way that includes everyone. It's a rising tide lifts all boats version of it.
Yes, because feminism hadn't always included everyone until your movie. Look, this essay is too long already, and it's not meant to be an explanation of feminism. It's not 2014 anymore, I don't think I need to go there, but it's obvious that these women have never intellectually engaged with feminist discourse, despite feeling comfortable profiting off of feminism. Look no further than Gloria's viral monologue.
Like, we have to always be extraordinary, and somehow we're always doing it wrong. You're supposed to be thin, but not too thin. And you can never say you want to be thin. You have to say you want to be healthy.
But you also have to be thin. You have to have money, but you can't ask for money because that's class.
You have to be a boss, but you can't be mean. You're supposed to lead, but you can't squash other people's ideas. You're supposed to love being a mother, but don't talk about your kids all the damn time. You're supposed to be a career woman, but always be looking out for other people. You have to answer for men's bad behavior, which is insane, but if you point that out, then you're accused of complaining. You're supposed to be pretty for men, but not so pretty that you tempt them too much or threaten other women. You're supposed to be part of the sisterhood, but also stand out, but also always be grateful.
You have to never get old, never be rude, never show off, never be selfish, never fall down, never fail, never show fear, never get out of line. It's too hard, it's too contradictory, and no one says thank you or gives you a medal, and in fact, it turns out somehow that not only are you doing it all wrong, but that everything is also your fault.
The dichotomy of it all, right? The dichotomy of it all, bro.
Gloria isn't telling women, even conservative women, anything they don't already know. And I'm not sure what men are supposed to be gleaning from this either. None of Gloria's contradictions seem to imply that the bad thing should go away, just that women should be able to participate too. She wants to be thin and not feel ashamed. She wants to have the power to be mean and squash people's ideas. She has no problem with rampant individualism. She's focused on her desires rather than the need to abolish the amorphous societal forces that define them. Also, if you're wondering why this monologue feels strangely familiar, it's because it sounds like a rewording of the Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie quote that got pulled for Beyoncé's 2013 song, Flawless. These monologues are the pinnacle of Gerwig's overbearing approach to filmmaking. Greta Gerwig seemingly has a pathological need to tell us that she's a virtuous intellectual. Gloria, who feels like her self-insert character, is filmed like she's giving us a TED Talk. Though, if I'm being honest, every woman has lines that feel like it's just Greta talking at us through them. Despite all of the on-screen diversity among the Barbies, if one white woman is speaking through all of them as herself, then it's hard for me to see them as real and distinct characters. This veil of diversity doesn't even extend off-screen, as a cursory glance over the IMDb credits predictably shows a lack of women of color in high-up production positions. This is the standard. Remember when Ariana Grande did a music video for God is a Woman that was directed, produced, and edited by 3 white guys? I was a Barbie kid, and I used to have this movie star Barbie, and it's funny because even in my child brain, I assumed that she was obviously director Barbie. I actually only realized this wasn't true while writing this essay. She literally had the clapper and the director's chair. What was I supposed to think? Growing up and seeing all the barriers to entry as a working class Latina makes me wish that I could go back to that naivety. It's a little infuriating to see Gerwig commoditize her womanhood to make a commercial, when so many of us just want the resources to follow our creative compulsions and are structurally unable to do so. And on top of everything, Gerwig supposedly made this feminist movie, and somehow nobody told her that it's weird to refer to women as females. Look, spicy take, but if you want to watch a feminist fairy tale that tackles the challenges of becoming a woman in the real world for the first time, against a backdrop of gorgeous handmade sets and Technicolor inspirations that, as a bonus, are not shot like a car commercial, there are better movies to watch. Where Gerwig came in with answers, PTA came in with questions and left us with more.
Being from California, you know, not that far from the oil fields, Bakersfield, you know, and the kind of curiosity about what the hell is this stuff and how do they get it out of the ground?
It's a great American story.
It is a great, it's great, irresistible.
Yeah.
And
I could probably write an entire separate essay on this movie. I won't, but I could. And 100 different people could probably write 100 different essays. Not just because it's absolutely exquisite, but because of the breadth and complexity that's contained within its intimate narrative. My favorite film studies professor in college once remarked, "I can tell that you're really interested in class politics." And I mean, of course I am. I grew up in an immigrant household where everything that was ever afforded to me came from the sweat of wage labor. That's the perspective I'm bringing to the analysis on this channel and just everything in my life. As an artist, first and foremost, my work might not be about my identities, but I wouldn't make the work that I do if it weren't for these experiences. This is why I'm coming to this film the way that I am. That being said, it's not inherently anti-capitalist to show the nature of capitalism. Like, someone could read this film as a story where Plainview pulls himself up by his bootstraps out of a literal hole in the ground, crawling with a broken leg into achieving the American dream. Even someone like Quentin Tarantino, who has the tools and experience to read cinema, came away saying this.
Daniel Day-Lewis's performance so embodies the character that you can imagine he did just that. And also, as much of a bastard as this man proves himself to be, that courage that it would have taken to do that actually gives him the heroic right for almost everything that he does throughout the rest of the movie. He went through hell to get this fortune. He is not just a blood-sucking businessman, even though the film does work very wonderfully as not even a metaphor, as text for the beginning of capitalism in the industrial age.
I don't feel the need to disagree with Tarantino. He is right that Plainview isn't just a spoiled, blood-sucking businessman. I just find it hard to watch him destroy himself and see it as heroic or as anything more than a tragedy. I don't personally see Plainview as the hero or the villain. United Oil could be the villain or the fake brother could be the villain, but I don't think it really matters. One thing that I'm struck by is how Anderson builds his story around Plainview's relationships with other men. As much as I can talk about the movie's connection to capitalism, the story ultimately is driven by his relationships with his son, his brother, and Eli. These characters are crafted in such compelling and strange ways that speak to Anderson's conception of himself as more of a writer. These men are in constant competition for validation from each other and power over each other. But their longing for vulnerability and their thirst for power will always be in conflict with one another. There Will Be Blood is ultimately a great tragedy. Plainview sees HW as something pure, and in the end, competition remains his way to divorce himself from emotion in order to free his son. The story is essentially devoid of women, and not to be controversial, but I don't think it needed them. Especially when so many movies use women merely as plot devices to move men forward. If anything, I think it's daring to not have women in this film, given that it's such an easy crutch to use their mistreatment as a signal of a character's immorality. There's no hollow mirroring of Plainview's domination of the earth through a domination of women. Daniel is seemingly uninterested in women at all, but will draw lines at their mistreatment. I think this avoidance is one of the many ways that he tortures himself. He's entirely unsexual and he's disgusted by Henry's debauchery. It's ultimately, at least in part, Henry's lack of sentimentality that gives his identity away.
We can eat and get some women. Take him to the Peachtree Dance. I say get liquored up and take him to the Peachtree Dance. Yeah.
That scene on the beach is so surreal and engrossing. He's at the horizon. He's reached the west. He's reached the coast all the way from Wisconsin. He won. And in this moment, he feels, to me, almost desperate for some vulnerability.
There's that house in Fond du Lac that John Hollister built. Do you remember it? I thought as a boy that was the most beautiful house I'd ever seen. I wanted it. I wanted to live in it. And eat in it. And clean it. And even as a boy, I wanted to have children to run around in it.
I don't know why, but the image of a young boy dreaming of cleaning his house is so mesmerizing. And I've thought about that single line maybe more than any other piece of dialogue in this movie. This entire moment is heart-wrenching and screams of his desire for love and family, but also of his deification of labor. It makes me think of being in Mark Twain's house for my birthday a few years ago, reading about how his happiest moments in life were when his children were young and running around his home. These images are moving to me in really similar ways. It's no coincidence that HW marries his childhood sweetheart. The absence of women is felt, not just as viewers, but by Plainview.
I think if I saw that house now, it'd make me sick.
I think this movie is able to interrogate masculinity in a way that is bold and insightful because it not only trusts itself, but it trusts the audience to meet it there through so much more than just its script. The cinematography, the score, the editing all leave space for and nurture our emotional involvement. There's a war inside of this man. He's emptying himself. We not only see this push and pull in him, but the movie swells and collapses us alongside him. The score reflects this sensation perfectly as opposed to just manipulating our emotions. As someone who likes music but doesn't know anything about music, I don't have the words for how this works, but I know that this is not what other movies sound like. Something special is happening here. Let me just say, the Kens are not doing any of this. Unlike so many of the other movies I've talked about in this essay, Anderson is not giving us his opinion on an issue. There's no take to agree or disagree with. As we saw with my last essay, people will find a way to make moral judgments even when the work isn't asking or requiring that of anyone. But as much as he can, I think Anderson does present you with a beautiful work to be experienced. Really quick, before we continue, thank you so much for watching this far. Especially if you're coming from our previous video, it's meant a lot to us to have had that do so well. If you're not subscribed and are enjoying what you're watching, please subscribe and send us a little like. It really does mean a lot to us. Now, back to the video. It's impossible for me to talk about politics in film without discussing the unparalleled oeuvre of Agnès Varda. She's one of my favorite artists, period, and the namesake of this channel, after all. I can't think of many artists who are as devoted to their love of people as she was, and who can communicate that love so absolutely and without judgment. She's a pioneer of her craft, and even when she's inventing the French New Wave, it feels as if it's an inevitability for her. Depending on who you ask, maybe Chabrol or Truffaut were first to the Nouvelle Vague. Others say Varda's technically a left-bank director. These designations of who's first and who belongs to which camp are sort of frivolous, yet not without ramification. All I know is that Agnès was a philosopher, a photographer, and an outsider who hadn't even really engaged with film before leaving her mark on the entire medium.
Talented, brilliant, incredible, amazing, show-stopping, spectacular, never the same, totally unique, completely not ever been done before, unafraid to reference or not reference, put it in a blender.
I'm an artist, but I had three lives. I've been a photographer, I've been a filmmaker, and I became a visual artist.
Agnès is personally one of my favorite examples of a filmmaker who came to motion pictures from still photography. As a fellow photographer with filmmaking aspirations, she's one of my biggest heroes. Her first film, La Pointe Courte, is undeniably photographic, and the inherent relationship between the two mediums is unavoidable in so much of her other work. Varda also came to film differently than her Cahiers du Cinema contemporaries. By her own claims, she'd only ever seen maybe 3 or 4 films before her directorial debut. Though she wasn't cinema literate, she understood the camera first and foremost. And this, coupled with her interest in literature and philosophy, was kind of all she needed. Most importantly, Agnès is an artist. Her naivete and genuine curiosity were the perfect recipe for this movie to be so groundbreaking and historically significant.
Ignorance, sheer ignorance, you know, there's no confidence to equal it. It's only when you know something about a profession, I think, that you're timid or careful.
This film brought her back to the small French fishing village where she lived in her adolescence, and her propensity for being a genuine observer is already prevalent here. She uses the real people of this village, almost entirely non-actors, to portray their day-to-day lives. These portraits are intercut with a Parisian couple meandering through the town as they contemplate their relationship. This juxtaposition and nonlinear structure was inspired by Faulkner's If I Forget Thee, Jerusalem, which has been pulled from by several other directors. There's a contradiction between her being a genuine observer and being an auteur, or, as Varda liked to call herself, a cinequeuriste. These contradictions, both inherent and constructed, are at the heart of all of her work. She weaves herself tightly into the details of these constructions and yet imbues them with naturalism. The film moves between deliberate still life into scenes whose dialogue is carefully considered but read as text. Apparently, she told her actors to read the dialogue and not act it. This rejection of the performance from her actors is echoed in her concern with subjects who operate outside of the performance of polite society. In La Pointe Courte, the fishermen help each other hide their bounties from the inspectors as they practice less than legal fishing. She films everything with a tenderness, and although each shot is immaculate, she still shows us the unglamorous hardship that she would have borne witness to growing up. Their harsh reality is paralleled by the Parisian couple, who exist outside of the fisherman's world entirely, having an existential conversation about the future of their relationship. Their moments are self-contained and shot in a way that feels like everything was highly arranged. Coming from photography, it makes sense that her work would precede a lot of the visual language of the French New Wave. I have to imagine that starting out with a small photo camera would shape your conception of what the camera can do and where it can go. She's not afraid to turn away from a traditionally cinematic visual language. It's funny because now we might look at a photograph similar to shots in Agnès' work and think of it as cinematic, but at the time, that's just not what cinema looked like. And to me, this movie and so much of her work feels so indisputably photographic. In my view, the Parisian couple, maybe more specifically Louis, is somewhat of a self-insert. He's also from this town and returning from Paris. She sets up this dichotomy between the classes, but she also recognizes herself as a member of the bourgeoisie. This self-awareness is at least part of the reason why she's able to show these characters with the sincerity that she does. Louis isn't being used to explain or, God forbid, list out these contradictions to us. I'm not militantly political enough to say, from now on, I'm gonna make films for the fishermen of La Pointe Courte and for the workers of the Renault factories so that they will enjoy it, but also recognize themselves and identify and think that it really concerns them. I'm not modest enough and not militant enough and too egotistical. I still participate in a bourgeois culture in which a film is made by an artist. When Agnès is in her work, and she is in all of her work, it feels like she's using the medium as a way to investigate herself and the world around her. It's so obvious if you've ever read or listened to the things she had to say that this is a woman who's spent her life asking questions. Not only was she incredibly generous in every interview she ever gave, but she's kind of a genius. And it's been hard to A, pick quotes for y'all, and B, summarize any of her thoughts when she's already said everything so perfectly.
Structure of cinema is more important than the story you tell. And that's how I made some films.
The significance of structure is integral to all of her work. In Cleo from 5 to 7, the structure is a movie in real time, and the contradiction to explore is that real time against Cleo's subjective time. From the beginning, her narrative exists in service of the structure and not the other way around. I think that's a huge reason why her films avoid being didactic even when they deal with class politics. In focusing on structure above character, she's able to work outside of traditional narrative constraints. The structure of archetypical narratives like the tragedy or the hero's journey necessarily imply morality as a literary device. However, in real life, as we know, people don't follow neatly packaged character arcs. In refusing this mode of working, her work approaches the real. Meanwhile, so many of her formal decisions make us aware of their own construction. Her films are asking to be read in their own language. Cleo's 90 minutes are rich in experience, and we don't know what she makes of them. Going through these moments with her in real time, I can't help but reflect on which 90 minutes or 2 hours of my own life have held this sort of weight and what I've done with them. Because we ultimately never know Cleo's fate, she doesn't change as a character within the bounds of the film. Cleo is a spoiled, narcissistic woman and a rather unlikable character. She's the prototypical Varda woman, complicated and somewhat unconsumable. Her interest in these kinds of characters confronts the political nature of what is deemed unacceptable. These women are complex and refuse to participate in what's expected of them. Not only are they not likable within the confines of their respective films, but they're not the contemporary ideal of the feminist woman. The conflict that Varda sets up around what it even means to be an unlikable woman has almost nothing to do with what are acceptable traits within masculinity or femininity. They're neither cool intellectuals nor tough girl bosses. They're not aspirational, and they're not perfectly imperfect either.
I think I try to be coherent about what I believe. I never made commercial. I don't want to sell cosmetics. I don't want to sell cars.
Et je me disais, j'aimerais faire un film qui soit pas tellement agréable à voir, mais auquel on pense beaucoup après. Ça, c'est une chose précise, en tout cas. C'est bien ce qui est arrivé, d'ailleurs.
Her films are almost antagonistic toward the viewer. The conflict of likability is less within her women and more in our relationship to them. It's important to remember the socio-political context in which she was making these films. Varda was very much a participant in the conversation happening around women's autonomy from racist, patriarchal, and capitalist structures. In Vagabond, Mona is so autonomous that she's completely disconnected from society. This ultimate expression of autonomy makes her neither virtuous nor a cautionary tale. Agnès refuses relatability, not in service of individuality, but in service of such a pure empathy. Mona, Agnès, and the film ask us to practice the radical acceptance that is required to actually challenge the punitive worldview that we've been conditioned into. A worldview that forces marginalized people into competition with each other and then judges them. It's not without meaning that where she directs this complete acceptance is toward the people who are not getting it anywhere else.
We've made it to the end. Thank you so much to everyone who's taken the time to watch this entire essay. It's taken us such a long time to complete this because we're only able to chip away at it during our small pockets of free time. I know it's been a bit of a monster, but I can't help but get a little carried away when I write. I've spent a lot of time here looking at and talking about movies that I don't like. And maybe that sounds counterintuitive from someone who loves movies, but I believe that film deserves to be taken seriously as a medium. The language of filmmaking imparts meaning, and oftentimes that's separate from the meaning of the story. I believe in doing more than just sharing my opinions, summarizing films, and being agreeable. I want to engage in real criticism, and I'd like to invite you on this journey with me. Some of the movies I've talked about have been seen by millions and millions of people, and I think that's why it's important to think about them. Truthfully, I might not have watched them if I didn't think they'd be useful in illustrating my points. Politics and film, much like every other facet of our lives, are inextricably linked. And so it's probably inevitable that people are going to try to preach their ideas through this medium. I'm interested in exploring why films with such overt political goals often crumble under the weight of their own ambitions. I'm not even just talking about ones with lukewarm centrist positions, but even people in my own communities on the left have a tendency to dismiss the importance of complicated art. Political critique doesn't inherently mean intellectual value. When movies don't come with explicit thesis statements and instead invite us to experience them, they force us to reflect upon ourselves in order to extract meaning. This requires a mutual respect with the audience. It's very beautiful and also powerful what art does when it's approached in a way that embraces both its possibilities and its limitations. Part of what makes a movie successful for me is how it gets us involved. As an artist, I believe in the death of the author. Once you make a work, it's gifted to the world. While you might have a specific intention with a work, it may ultimately end up doing something else. My favorite film, Playtime by Jacques Tati, is, according to him, a look at modernity. But regardless of what his intentions were, I can't help but see capitalism and friendship as central themes in this movie. And all themes aside, God, am I grateful that he gave us this movie and that I've been fortunate enough to see it. It's such a true joy to watch. Moreover, one of the reasons why I love Agnès so much is because she's not only generous when she speaks to us, but she also puts enough substance into her work for it to be read.
Prise de conscience, parce que le cinéma c'est un meeting permanent avec le public. Dans une salle de cinéma, vous avez catholiques, musulmans, gaullistes, communistes et tout ça. Quand le film est bon, chacun perçoit et accepte ce qu'il veut. C'est ça qui m'a amené au cinéma pour mieux poursuivre ma quête de militantisme. Le cinéma devient pour nous un outil important. Et il est de tous les arts l'expression les plus faciles et les plus agréables pour un grand public.
I appreciate Semben's point of view on this because it introduces complications, which are beyond the scope of this essay, but are still important. Agnès and many other filmmakers have made films that are much more explicit in their position as tools for activism. For some, that's come in the form of documentary, which is an essay for another day, but documentaries are an important counterpoint for how to use film as a way to disseminate information. Coming back to McKay's desire to educate through his recent films, I think The Big Short was his most successful of the trilogy because of its proximity to documentary. There have been plenty of movies that are based on true stories, but by his own admission, he was interested in explaining and not shying away from the mechanics of the complex financial systems that led to the 2008 financial crisis. He combined the accessibility of the medium and his experience with making entertainment to help people gain an understanding of what happened. I feel like The Big Short was a good time, and the farther he strayed from that balance, the less successful I think his films were. For what it's worth, I think he seems like a genuinely cool guy, and I'd probably like hanging out with him. When asked about Vice, he literally told Variety, "I regret not giving more blame to the Democrats who went along with the war in Iraq. I had a heart attack in post-production. I made mistakes, read the reviews, and went, yes, fair." It's refreshing to see someone in his position both take criticism and actually admit to the Democrats' involvement in the war on terror. I want to include a couple more moments that I think, for better or worse, are kind of brave.
My dream would be that if everyone right-wing and left-wing just said, if you're not for putting Glass-Steagall back, if you're not for breaking up the big banks, I'm not going to vote for you. I don't care if you're right-wing or left-wing. You don't get my vote. And if we did that, it would change like that. It would change in like 2 seconds.
People will justify their own good fortune no matter what. So you can go up to a random person and give them $10 million, and 2 weeks later they'll be like, I always knew this was going to happen. I'm just that kind of guy. And a lot of Wall Street has that. And with all due respect to any Wall Street people. But actually, no respect to any Wall Street people. Fuck them.
It's a bit shocking to hear someone from Hollywood say that their dream is for people to withhold their votes and be so pro-collective action. He seems to genuinely care and be critical. It's pretty impressive. From what I can tell, it seems like our worldviews overlap a little, but that doesn't make him my favorite filmmaker because I don't watch things to agree with them. There's no one way to make a good movie either. Agnès Varda and Paul Thomas Anderson, for example, are pretty different in their approach. And yet, they've both offered us films that are rich, complex, and worth the time they demand. I understand that part of watching a demanding movie means that you have to meet it there too, as a viewer. And not everyone can do that every time. But isn't that the reason why we want to improve life for people? So that we can have more time and energy, but also the tools and skills with which to have more meaningful experiences. I understand that the situation in the US regarding literacy rates is concerning, and perhaps reading period is more pressing than reading movies. But if you're gonna engage with political films, then you need to understand what you're getting into. Because, as Semben noted, movies are accessible and appealing to a large audience, people are going to be engaging with propaganda. Not all propaganda is inherently bad, but you can't make that decision for yourself if you don't understand that what you're watching is propaganda to begin with. Listen, I'm not judging anyone for wanting to watch fun movies or for wanting to be entertained. I mean, I love You've Got Mail, a charming but supremely capitalist movie that does not reflect the world I want to live in, but I'm aware enough to know what I'm getting myself into. Film is a language, and yes, it's a lot to ask people to learn an entirely new language, but in the same way that there are words in other languages that can express things that we can't in our own, you can express things with film that can't be said in any other way. Hey y'all! I feel like I might have given myself some psychic damage from watching some of these movies, so if you can hit that like button, we'd really appreciate it. What are some of your favorite political films, or films with political implications? Leave a comment down below, I'd love to hear them. Thank you guys so much again, we'll see you in the next video.
If you're in a position to donate, please help Nada and her husband Ahmed. They have 3 beautiful daughters. Her daughter Maria and her husband suffer from epilepsy and currently don't have access to medication. Link to donate in the description. Thank you.